For those of you who are with us on the first webinar, welcome back. For those of you who are new, welcome in. The sort of the topic that we're about today is thinking about how to position your research and do your research in a way that is both rigorous and relevant. We'll try and outline that a little bit for you as we get into this. Joining us today are kind of our special guest is John Boudreau. And we'll let John talk a little bit about his journey. In fact, that's kind of the theme, I think, of the webinar today is looking at someone's journey as they have thought about being an academic, thought about being a researcher, and doing so with some balance. And listen to how John's journey has evolved in that sense. Along with John, Sue and I, Sue Mohrman and I will be kind of moderating the panel during the day, during the meeting. And I'll be looking, as carefully as I can at the screen to see if anybody has raised their hand so that we can get some other voices in the room. I'll also do my best to sort of monitor the chat and again, bring your voice into the room as best as we can as we get along. Okay? So those are the particulars. We'll sort of see if we can get started here a little bit. The book, we just got an email yesterday saying, supply chains have now hit book publishing. And so the book was supposed to be out, I think literally might have been today. And they said it's going to be delayed because of supply chain issues. So don't hold your breath. It's on its way. And at the end of the webinar, we've got a slide that shows and includes a code that you can use to go get the book at a steeply discounted price. So as being part of the RRBM, we've got that deal set up with the publisher, so you can grab a copy of the book and at a decent price. I think one of the most central notions in the book is an idea of a sweet spot. And we came to that term because we wanted to find a phrase or an idea that would communicate to people that we're trying to find this balance between a set of tensions that speak to the kind of research that we want to do that is both rigorous and relevant. And again, I'll try and get into that in a moment. So we kind of put the definition of sweet spot up there so people could get a sense of our intention, what we're trying to do in working in this kind of research. Our agenda here is especially for those of you who weren't on the first webinar a couple weeks ago, just make sure that you have some of the frameworks that we talk about in the book that begin to put things out and how it comes together. Sue's going to talk a little more deeply about the research stream and the network that's involved. And between those two things that Sue and I will talk about, that will, I think, have set the stage for us to be in a panel with John and talk to him about his experience and his evolution as a researcher. And so you can bring some of those frameworks to life, okay? Along the way, we're going to try and pause and create some space for people to bring their voice into the room. And then we'll sort of make a link at the end to the final session with Sue and Rob Cross and Phil Mirvis. Okay. So one of the frameworks, it kind of back to that concept of the sweet spot. It suggests that what we're trying to do with our research, either in a specific project or maybe a program of research, is balance out three dimensions that are somewhat in tension with each other. On the one hand, you may source your research questions in theory and looking for gaps, looking for assumptions that need to be challenged or something like that. Or you source your research questions in practice. You're noticing phenomena that people are struggling with in the real world. And the tension there is one where you may have to make some sacrifices, right? If you're purely in theory, you spend all your time reading the journals, getting into the theory, discussing the theory with other scholars, and you're really, really deep into that. But because of that, you may be disconnected from practice. On the other hand, if you're a pure consultant and you're out there doing work all the time with organizations, and that's a full-time job in and of itself, you may be a little less connected into the literature. So finding a way to stay in both is a bit of a challenge. And there may be some trade-offs you have to make in your life and in your work in order to be in that tension. But by the same token, if you are trying to set your methods to be very, very rigorous, because that meets the standards of the A journals and things like that, you may have to feel like you're sacrificing a little bit to get your work done out in the real world, where relevance is the standard. And again, there's a tension there. How can I randomize my sample? How can I look for control variables? In the real world, in practice, you may have to sacrifice some of those things. How can you look for alternative explanations that occur in a natural field experiment, for example? So that, again, there's a tension there, and trying to find that sweet spot can be sometimes frustrating, because you want your data to be really, really solid, because you want to go for a great journal. But in order to get your work done and to have it credible in the eyes of practitioners, you may have to sacrifice a couple of things. And on the last dimension, it's who do you speak to? Who do you write for? Are you writing for an audience that is going to use your work? Or are you writing your work for an audience that wants to think about how it contributes to theory? And again, there's a sacrifice there. Sometimes the way we write in our technical journals and our academic journals is quite a bit different than the language we use for practitioners. And so sometimes I often joke, sometimes you have to write everything twice, because you have to sort of adjust the language and use cases as opposed to statistics to reach your audience. So the sweet spot is about sort of finding that balance and managing those tensions, either in one project or over time. And that's kind of the tension that we've dealt with. And something that Sue and I talked about last time that we didn't do, and I want to be sure that as we wrote this book, one of the shoulders we stood on was Andy Van de Ven's book on engaged scholarship. I mean, it's just a really brilliant piece of work. And as we stood on that critical realism philosophy that he has, we stood from there and tried to get into this sweet spot and talk about the methods for doing so. The second big framework is recognizing that knowledge gets produced in a value chain, roughly from left to right, where there's academic disciplines and there's discussion about theory, and that theory gets revised, tested, and produced, and eventually finds its way into practice, typically, through teaching and cases and textbooks. But there's other methods as well. And so on the one hand, there's a knowledge generating value stream here that goes from left to right as we try and produce knowledge that is both practical and rigorous. At the same time, there's a social network behind this. And I'm going to have ask Sue if she'll talk a little bit about some of that social network, because I think that's where we want to get John's perspective on a lot of this. Behind this is not just knowledge being generated, but there's people generating it and people in relationship with each other. And that becomes a really important part, I think, of the how-to notion of our work. So with that, Sue, let me let you sort of talk a little bit about and go deeper into this model, especially with respect to the social networking stuff.
Okay, happy to.
There you go.
All righty, thanks. And I think that social network issue is really a key one. Some of the questions for reflection that we have in our book are, how can you take into account and connect to knowledge from organizational practice? And it's definitely not sitting in your office looking at statistics and patterns. The last time I shared my public school experience and how our theories and intervention techniques from the field of OD didn't work in the school system. And once you spent a lot of time with teachers and talking to them, you found out why, that they were living in an environment where The only time they had to think about what they were doing was at an offsite or a meeting, and they didn't really have the capability in a classroom to do any of the things that they wanted to do, because the problems that came into their classroom, the size, the number of kids that were completely disengaged, et cetera, the number of kids that showed up 3 days out of 5, and had huge gaps in the flow of knowledge, was so overwhelming that they were just really coping. And had we started all over again, we probably would have used a coping framework in order to help them to start to think about what they needed to do different. But none of us had really ever been in a school system where we understood the depth of the issues there. The second question is, how can I combine the knowledge of practice with the knowledge from my own and other disciplines and shed light on the problem being investigated? We think that that's the essence of sweet spot research and the essence of adding value to practice. And third, which pathways are best suited for getting my research findings into practice? I think the standard pathway, when I went into the field at least, was you do your research, you write your articles, you use it in your teaching. If you're fortunate, other people will use it in their teaching. And so it goes to a set of students, or either undergraduate students or MBA students, whichever. And then that's really the flow. And the flow, often the only feedback you get is from the student perspective. And the reward is for getting the publications out and doing teaching and sharing in a classroom. But if you think about when people go to school, they only go to school once or twice in their life. And that means that the rest of the time, no one's getting value from your work if you aren't figuring out how to get it into actual organization settings. And then the question we'll talk about today a lot is, what help and resources do I need to move along those pathways? How do I actually move knowledge? And that's a different way, I think, for academic researchers to think about the issues of how do I become useful to practice. Is I also have to think about how that gets there. I'm just like anybody else in a value stream. If I produce something, it's a great idea. If it gets to those who can use it, then it actually has been useful and relevant to the audiences that you want to reach, or the customers you want to reach in the case of a business. Okay, Chris, could you change? Yep. Yeah, thanks.
I was doing a chat thing.
Chat thing. Okay.
But I'm back.
So here is a kind of a redrawing of the picture. And what it shows is a lot of networks, the networks that underlie the research itself. And I want to reiterate that we have intentionally put organization practice knowledge as one of the knowledge bases needed for the research programs on the left. That can be in the form of co-researching. It can be in the form of really having intense field relationships that are informing your knowledge. But that knowledge of practice needs to be added to the academic disciplines in order to get out of the ivory tower and into the field. On the right are the theory-based knowledge products that actually include theory that has been developed and enlightened by practice, not just by other theoretical perspectives. And then practice accessible knowledge products that practitioners can actually take. That's actually from an empirical study that we did about useful research. And that's actually a picture of the networks that were around a stream of research. In this case, it was science research. And it was around nanoscience development. And these are core basic theory-based scientists. And these were the social networks that they needed to get their science into practice. And that's a lot. So how do you decide where you're going to play? In Andy Mandevin's engaged research talks about getting closer and closer to practice with things like assessment or evaluation research. And for sure, practitioner feedback and collaborative research all along the way. Please move it, Chris. I'm sorry. Are you okay? Can you move it to the next slide?
Oh,
okay.
There.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Okay.
He says that, which worries me. So on our right is our little picture of the cycle. Researchers learning from practice, practitioners learning from research. And in between that is a whole lot of research and a whole lot of application in practice that lets you advance. This really, if you, probably the best explication of that cycle comes from the work of Carl Weick, who talks about researchers doing research without testing and in practice and getting feedback are actually studying a fantasy. They're not studying a real phenomenon in the real world. And you can only move your research forward if you get that kind of feedback. And in the course of doing this research, you're positioning yourself in time and space. If you look at that flow, there's a feedback loop. There is a loop through time. It is not just a one-way flow from the ivory tower to practice, from your research to practice, but the knowledge base you're working with is shifting. The foundational and theoretical basis underpinning the rigor required to be a scholar has changed during our careers. The evolution of practice as technology advances, societal, ecological, geopolitical contexts unfold through time. I'm currently doing some work, a little study in mostly Southeast Asia, but it's a global company. And 5 years ago, when I did a similar project, the geopolitical situation was different. The ecological pressures that companies were feeling was not quite as extreme. And the technology advances that allowed the integration of work around the world were still fairly nascent. Right now, they're extraordinarily strong and pervasive, and in many cases determining the nature of the work that's done. So I've had to change how I think about understanding how you can help an organization to optimize performance based on what's changed. The tensions and often shifting and conflicting preferences, the power relations among stakeholders are constantly becoming clear and shifting. And as a consequence of that, it's only natural that the network of connections that are needed to generate relevant knowledge and increase the likelihood that it will inform practice are also changing and growing. And we talked last time about that picture of the value stream is a picture that has become more and more complex over the multiple decades that we have been part of this practice. So if you have a core belief, which we do, that researchers should be adding value to the world in which they live. And if you have a core belief, as we do, that is becoming more and more of a mandate, both from society, from the funders of research, and from simply the state of the world in general, then you really have to think about positioning yourself both in time and space. The time positioning, and John will be talking to this, it's how do you start to look forward, because the world changes so quickly that if you're looking at the current, you're probably going to miss what's in place by the time you're done with your research. So, okay, so we're going to turn this over and you can change to the next slide, Chris, although it's a filler slide.
It's a filler slide, but a quick question, I think, from the chat box that I think was really cool was, Jane talked about the addition of the foundations of critical realism are important because it's about the emergence of something new from an interdisciplinary knowledge development and use in an ecological system. I think that's really quite accurate, right? You talked about how the political system had changed, but every time you go into the field with an idea, things have changed, theories change, and all these ideas have to become emergent.
Yeah, and I think both Andy Van de Ven and Carl Weick are really persuasive in saying it's your best understanding at a point in time, but it is constantly needing to evolve. Yeah. Right. Okay. So we're going to
sharing. There you go.
Yeah, we're going to turn this over to John. John Boudreau has been our colleague at University of Southern California CEO for a couple decades. And before that, he was at Cornell University and some other identities as well. And he has made a very intentional and steady shift from a fairly traditional academic beginning to being very, very close to and doing his work totally in the context of practice, although based in a university. And I think started with the same aspiration that all of us probably did, which is to really make a difference in some things that were important to him. So John, would you spend some time talking about that journey and what propelled you, and along the way, what kinds of networks of support and interaction you have drawn upon to do your work?
John, you're muted.
Muted.
Okay, thanks everybody. Can you hear me now, Chris? Sometimes I stay muted just so I can come off mute and have people verify that they can hear me.
Keep us busy.
Right. So thanks, Sue. I think you and Chris obviously have made some extraordinarily important points and really codified what a lot of us have lived through here. I think for those watching and I'll be thinking about that ecosystem that Sue and Chris do with kind of a research network in one circle and a practice network in another circle, and then thinking about these bridging elements. So my story will be a lot about colleagues. So let me say that right at the start, beginning with, of course, Chris and Sue, but then a whole lifetime of really good colleagues that kept me with one foot in academia and I think one foot in practice. Probably if we go back to, I know people have, Denise Rousseau and others have talked about their origin story, Sue and Chris as well. You know, for me, I think probably the origin of my interest in work and the workplace was with my father, my late father, who worked for IBM back in the 60s. It was a very wonderful company to work for, unique in its amount of benefits that it provided, the kind of safety net that it provided, attention to development and careers and all that sort of thing at the time, really pioneering. And my dad worked way away from headquarters, and he was a computer fixer when you had to go into big buildings. And one night on a Friday, he said, "Why don't you come with me?" And I went with him at night, and he and his team worked all night on this computer that was in a big room, and you had to take down the walls and find the wires. And in the morning, I woke up having slept on a bench, and we were driving home, and I said, "Do you like your job?" And he said, "You know, I do. IBM's a wonderful company, but I wish my supervisor knew how much it would mean to this team for them to take us out to dinner now that we've completed this really big job." He said, "In IBM, the policy is that the salespeople go out to dinner when they meet their goals or beat their goals, but the repair people don't." And he wasn't really complaining, but it struck me that that's such a simple thing for a supervisor to know. And I guess even then it got me thinking, why wouldn't a supervisor know that? And can a company really run with that kind of a gap and that kind of a difference in perception? And then, you know, as an undergraduate in Southern New Mexico, I had two marvelous mentors, Art Watley and Dan Costley, and they were teaching from a book called Work in America that was written by these two people, Ed Lawler and Jim O'Toole. Well, it turned out decades later, Jim O'Toole and Ed Lawler would be colleagues of mine at USC. And that book, Work in America, also struck me because it was very much about practice, but it was practice of things like teams. These radical things like giving the people on the assembly line the opportunity to stop the assembly line and fix something or make a suggestion. And a lot of attention to the idea that why did feedback have to come through a supervisor? I remember a video with a wonderful metaphor where they had a bowling alley, you know, where you throw the ball down at the pins, and they put a black curtain over the middle of it. And so you'd roll the ball and it'd go behind this black curtain, and a supervisor would stand there and watch what happened. And then they turn around and say, "You hit 3 pins." And then you'd roll the ball again and they give you performance feedback and say, "Oh, you hit 2 more pins." And obviously, if you lift the curtain and just let the feedback happen directly, it's a much better system. So this just led me to say, I had a lot of people saying, well, go get your PhD in marketing or strategy and all that stuff. And I said, I really want to study this human element. That took me to Purdue. I got an MBA along the way to my PhD. That's one reason I chose the program at Purdue. So I was in classes in finance, marketing, strategy, accounting, all that sort of thing, and had to sort of, achieve in those courses enough to get my MBA. So I was in the case studies with people who were going on to executive careers. It was very striking how much more rigor, how much more attention there was to things like accounting, finance, operations, and marketing than there was to this thing called HR. Certainly good HR classes, but I saw those leaders leaving with far more rigor in the way they thought about money and other things. And that turned out to be very prescient. I decided to do my PhD in an area that was emerging back in the 80s, and it's kind of faded away a little bit, that was about calculating the payoff from things like better selection, better recruitment, better training, et cetera. It was called utility analysis in those days. And it came because my PhD program, the method was very mathematics oriented. It was very oriented toward deriving the formulas for things like the best formula for a correlation coefficient, the best estimate of something. And in addition to applying the tools, I spent a lot of time working out the math and the first derivatives of normal curves and that kind of thing. So this utility analysis area had a lot of formulas in it, but it also, the outcome was something I thought managers would be fascinated with, which was how much you'd be better off in your company if you recruited better, if you selected better, if you trained better. So I spent, and it turned out I was very lucky. The research journals in industrial psychology were very interested in working on these formulas at the time. So it was an editorially acceptable area. Editors were eager to see people working on this interface between the things that psychologists do, like better testing, which is reported in correlation coefficients, which no managers understand, and the translation of those correlations and regressions into dollars. And so what if somebody was a better performer? How much value would that create? And so that was kind of where my PhD was. I wasn't really working. I didn't do a survey PhD. I didn't do an experimental PhD. That was all in my program, but I was also spending a lot of time in the business school on things like industrial relations and labor economics. So I decided I'll do my PhD developing formulas and embellishing these ideas about how to calculate payoff. And as I said, it turned out I was kind of lucky because the research journals were interested in that. And so then off to Cornell University, and I spent 22 years there, and then I'll let people get a word in edgewise here in a minute, I promise. And again, great colleagues there, Lee Dyer, George Milkovich, eventually Sarah Rines, Barry Gerhardt, Bob Bretz, Tim Judge. These are iconic names in the world of human resource and IO psychology research. And also, to a person, they all came through programs like University of Wisconsin, Minnesota, all through programs where this human resource discipline defined itself as, instead of being org behavior or IO psychology, which tended to be more academic, this human resource discipline was struggling to be something where human resource leaders would find something interesting and useful in our research. And Cornell was trying to be one of the leading places in the world at that interface. So you can see that I also got lucky joining a program that was more academic and practice focused. There were lots of other programs closer to IO industrial psychology that would have taken me in a much more academic direction, or an organizational behavior program. So I was also lucky that Cornell and the colleagues there were already placing a great importance on practice. George Milkovich and Lee Dyer were well known in the business world. They were top speakers, top consultants to heads of HR. Cornell was a program where lots of heads of HR in big companies had graduated. And the students from Cornell were actively recruited by companies in HR. So the HR discipline in this School of Industrial Relations was seen as the discipline that made that bridge. And that's the group that I was a part of. So you can see how today it seems a little dated, but back in the 80s, the human resource discipline was really looking for its place. And there was a great deal of attention and interest in people who could and were interested in bridging that gap. Honestly, it was very natural for me. Virtually every time you presented a research seminar at Cornell, the question to me would be, what would a human resource leader do with the results of your study? George Milkovich and I became rather famous when people would interview at Cornell and present their research. Everybody knew that either George or John was going to ask the question, what would you say to an HR leader about how they could use the results of your study? So this is the world that I lived in. And I was lucky enough that this idea of calculating the payoff to things like better selection, better training was very popular with editors, and it attracted colleagues who were interested in making that bridge. Okay, so that was the 80s, early 90s. I also was lucky that I had other colleagues. I managed to generate some large data sets from we'd call them headhunters or search firms that had a lot of data about executives and their careers. And again, in partnership, one of those search firms came to me and said, we know you're studying about turnover and its effect on organizations. We think we have an interesting database where you could study the turnover of executives. And so we formed a partnership. And from that database, a lot of PhD students and my colleagues did work on careers and personality and turnover and that sort of thing that I got to be a part of. And so there was this. What I'm saying is I had more academically oriented colleagues who could do great work with surveys, and we were collaborating. So I had this survey work being published in academic journals with star performers like Tim Judge, Barry Gerhardt, et cetera. And then I had this more practical research on utility analysis that was attracting people like Sarah Rines and others to extend that work. And then I lived at Cornell where we always had these HR executives arriving every year. George and Lee would convene sort of an affinity group where they'd invite the heads of HR to come to Cornell and sit in a room and listen to what we were working on. It was an amazing pioneering thing. And by 1988, I got a big grant from the military to again study this payoff from better investments in human resources. A lot of overhead went to the school, and the dean at that time and I had a talk, and I said, we already have this affinity group that meets every year. What if we put some of this overhead money behind that and made it a real center? It wasn't just my idea. Lee and George contributed to it. But in 1988, that was the start of a thing called the Center for Effective Organizations. That was a formal unit now with an office, with a staff. The head of HR at IBM, Walt Burdick, was kind enough to provide one of his top HR leaders to become our first executive director and to sort of pay him to take a sabbatical and help us create a bridge between the research at Cornell and practice. And it now became very institutionalized with meetings several times a year. And the model was kind of come to Cornell and learn what the academics are working on. That was the promise to these HR leaders. And because they recruited at Cornell and they knew the professors and the students talked about them, they were willing to come to Cornell to listen to us translate. And that's really what we were doing in those sessions. So you had this engine over here of Cornell, all doing academic research, but this Center for Effective Organizations was built as kind of a translation and meeting place. And so that became a very big engine to motivate the researchers at Cornell to have something interesting to say every year, every 6 months or so during that period. And so that led us into the 90s. By the 90s,
let me interrupt you, John. Let me interrupt you,
Thank
John.
you, Chris.
There's a couple of great stories here. I want to pull out as much as we can.
Thank you for interrupting.
Well, because the cars stuff is obviously a twisting point. So let's hold it there. First, Ibrat, you had your hand up, so I wanted to see if you had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question. I don't know, I might be jumping ahead a little bit in this presentation, but it kind of touches on what John said. But also, I think it's a question which might be also open to all the speakers. It also alludes to the earlier slide that you were showing. It's the connection between practice and theory. one things we seem to be doing relatively well, relatively, I think we tend to do, we aspire to do really well, is learn from practice to generate theory. What are your thoughts on how do you move from theory into practice? In that, once you work on your PhD, say, on a piece of research, you develop a particular theoretical conceptual understanding, how do you take it back into practice? And also perhaps, over time, how do you move between the two, right? Using your conceptual insights, taking into practice, and then learning from practice again to refine your conceptual insights. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And Chris, I can give a pretty quick example of that.
Sure, go ahead.
So it's a great question you brought. Let me use this idea. So I'm going to use this idea of utility analysis to show what we mean. Okay, so here, back in the 80s, here was this idea. Here are the IO psychologists and HR researchers, and they have all these wonderful things like selection tests, personality tests, job previews, etc. And those things are showing significant correlations with ratings of job performance. And the psychologists are saying, look, to the practitioners, you should be using these tests. If you don't use these tests and just use interviews, you are selecting badly. And you're going to get people who don't perform well. And that should be obvious to you. And they would say, look at my correlation. It is 0.35. And that's statistically significant. Please adopt. So the theory is personality predicts job performance. Past work experiences predict job performance. Culture fit predicts job performance. All these theories that result in a correlation. And the frustration was, surprisingly, the managers aren't adopting these things just based on a correlation. So lots of my early work was, how can I take that correlation and translate it into the dollar value that you get if someone improves better? How much is that worth? Well, it turned out to be returns on investment like 100%, maybe more, for investing in this thing, right? So here I am, I'm trying to say, here's all this theory, it produces these correlations. I'm going to now tell you, here's a formula to calculate the dollar value. Maybe that will get you to adopt these things, right? And that was a lot of my early work, demonstrating and sort of refining, how could it be 100%? How could it be 1,000%? What could we be missing? Now, on the practice side, people aren't paying much attention. And we're hearing that they still want to do their interviews. Sarah Rines joins me, and we see that people still want to recruit from all the same places, even though we have a formula that shows that if you recruit at better places, like there's an interesting trade-off between recruiting at elite colleges where you won't get very many people to join you, but they're all very good, versus recruiting at a mid-level college where they're mediocre, but there are some stars there and they might be more likely to join you. You see what I mean? And to us, this was an obvious way to think about recruitment, these trade-offs. And we found, no, we just want to go back to the school that our CEO graduated from. Thank you very much. And we could say, but you're losing money. Look at how obvious this is. So that was very much my dilemma in the 80s, was why are these leaders not seeing what seems so obvious? And that eventually that became some publications to try and publish and gather data about their reactions to these formulas. That was kind of the late 80s, early 90s. Great deal of frustration on my part that all this work I had done to develop these wonderful frameworks wasn't landing.
May have propelled you to your next move in your career.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
So stay tuned for chapter 2, Ibra.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
How do we connect what we've learned to practice?
Yeah. The other thing I want to point out too, though, is back to your CARS environment, right? And I think it's a good question in terms of the specific situation for you, right? You're sitting there with that group of people. Some of them are academics. Some of them are very plugged into practice.
Yes.
In the presentation, somebody's going to ask, what is the CHRO going to do with that? So there is this context that you're in that says, better take care of your publishing. And by the way, it's not going to sit there in the ether. It's got to find a way out. So I think that context is important. Here's the specific case. And then as I think about our audience, the 160 people we got out there, what context are you in?
Mhm.
Are you in a context where I think our poll last week or 2 weeks ago, Sue said most everybody was in a context where they were being pushed to get their stuff out into the A journals.
70%. Yep.
70%. So here's 160 people if we're roughly the same sample as a couple of weeks ago, you're all in the context of being told, get your stuff out there into the journals. Think about where you're positioning yourself in your next move, right? To Sue's point about John's career, what's that next move going to look like? And are you going to put yourself in a context where it's okay, maybe even encouraged to do both? I think that's just a good, important contextual piece to look at as we think about the network that Sue was talking about. I got a good question here in the chat, Sue. An important element of the opportunity to do this work, this is from Jane McKenzie. The important opportunity to do this sort of work is dependent on whether the substantive focus of the research is something that really resonates with organizational concerns as well as the capacity to translate theory effectively. And so I think you sort of got it.
Yeah, no, I really think that's true and I think my school example is an example of that, where we thought the work we were doing about how you actually improve a teaching setting was going to be very relevant to teachers. We had teachers on our research team, et cetera. Their concerns weren't about, can I make a tweak in the curriculum that will interest kids more so they'll behave differently? They knew that wasn't going to work. Their concern was, I'm in a social system that is totally out of control. And in that system, I don't know how to teach. That's a very different set of concerns. But almost all the academic research in education schools was looking at the former. What can we do to change the content so they come and they get excited? And first you had to get them to come awake, interested every day in order to do that. And that is a very different challenge, but it was all consuming.
Great.
Eventually,
and then another one from Tobias. I think both of you, Sue and John, can speak to this one. Tobias Palm asks, in the rapidly changing times, back to your story, Sue, about the political things in the work in Asia, is there actually novelty within practices, within human resource practices? Do you see novelty happening? And again, I think back to balancing, novelty in our research and how we're generating new practices, and then us actually seeing novelty within the practices themselves. Rapidly changing times. So that was his question about, is there actually novelty within practices, within human resources?
And
practices?
I think talking about your next two steps is really going to enlighten that issue. Well,
Okay.
there is, but there isn't, right? So maybe you could give them a little of the next steps and looking for novelty.
oh, sure, I see.
Getting to the future of and starting to create some frameworks that would make people do it differently.
I might, before I move on, I might say, many of you were not even born probably in the 80s, but anyway, if in the 80s there was no LinkedIn, there was no social media, there were not even personal computers. Indeed, one of the things that we did at Cornell in about 1984 was the head of HR at IBM and I got to talking about this thing called a personal computer and how it might be used in human resources. And he said, why don't we build a room at Cornell and put 50 of these things called a PC in it. And you guys can teach a class where students figure out how a computer might do things for HR. So that's how early the days were, right? These, everything standalone, no cell phones, no nothing. So what I'm getting at is we had to build Cornell we had to build the Center for Advanced HR Studies as an analog thing. You come there, you sit with us. Now, so that's hard for a lot of you. I mean, you can't just say, I'm going to form a center. Some of you may be able to form a center around your own work. I see Ann Sui's on the line here, and thank you for your comment, Ann. Wonderful to see you. You know, Ann has been very good at building centers around her own work, where there's a practical translation there. Many of you may not have that opportunity, but you now have a social media opportunity. And so that may be the place where you start to post or other things like that. Maybe there's someone in your school that is good at helping you translate research into things like that and create a presence out there. A lot of people who are bridging the gap now really are not, they're not in a center so much, but they're known in the practical world because of what they've done on social media, et cetera. So that's just one thing. And then, so then in terms of you know, kind of moving ahead, and what I began to realize, I think to Sue's point about, in some ways it was the dysfunctional social world of education that was in the way. It's a thing near and dear to my heart because my daughter has now 40 years old, has become kind of famous speaking about fear in schools and that surrounding social milieu. She doesn't really do much at all with curriculum. All of her attention is how to deal with the fear that you all feel at school and your students feel and get past that. So in my case, the version of that, the parallel to that was, here we are over in the academic world, and we believe that we're sort of finding truth, or at least we're finding unearthing patterns that are valid, like cognitive ability cognitive ability predicts job performance. Job attitudes predict turnover. And when we come to organizations, they're not adapting them. They're not listening to them. And what we found was that there's a lot of pressure to create a program in HR. There's a lot of pressure to have an answer when someone says, do something about turnover. And that pressure means people aren't looking for evidence. They're looking for a program. And they're often looking for the one that everybody else did. Well, in my day, it was, let's just do that thing that GE did to stop turnover. Let's do that thing that IBM did. Let's look around for a best practice. That was my dilemma. And what I realized was that it was that social milieu. HR had a very different value proposition than to do evidence-based work. HR often wasn't even evaluated on its return on investment. It was just evaluated by having a program to offer. So that also goes to the question about emerging best practices. I think in some ways you have to be careful because the world of HR is not looking for questions about evidence-based, the next evidence-based thing. I mean, I think some people in HR care about that, but the reality is often what I need is an answer to my executive wants to see me doing something about X. What I really want is to stop that executive from asking me, what are you doing about X? And the best way to do that is to deliver a program. And to be honest, whether it is evidence-based or not really that big a deal. Nobody's ever going to really know. And so we began to write articles about fads and fashions and how maybe that was the theory that we ought to use to predict the adoption of HR practices. And that's about the time that I, for various personal reasons, it was important to move west, many family reasons. And that prompted me to start saying maybe I would move instead of I'd never move from this eastern United States part of to the western part. Very soon and very graciously, Ed Lawler realized I was saying maybe I would move. Ed created a position at USC, a beautiful work of the institution that placed me in his Center for Effective Organization, as well as a professor, tenured full professor in the academic department. So again, USC was extraordinarily attractive because you had Center for Effective Organizations with people like Chris and Sue and Ed, and then also an academic department that was friendly to my work on HR from an academic and theoretical perspective, and would allow me to teach a class in competitive advantage through people, for example. So that was very attractive to me, and by now the institution knew what I was. So by now there was no issue of how much publishing will you do in A journals? How much time will you spend with companies? I was kind of a known entity by now. And so the institution created a position where a lot of those questions were already answered. And it was understood by both sides that I was going to have a foot in both sides. And again, CEO, gathering place for executives in org design, HR. That one reason was this org design element was something I hadn't spent much time in. And it's in a business school, which at least nominally is interested in translation into practice. Chris and Sue, I'll let you guide me a little on what I'm happy to talk about many things, as you know. Maybe you can guide me a little on what might be useful or what's showing up in the chat.
Well,
Go ahead, Sue.
I find really interesting once you got to USC, sort of the switch in focus that then took you to what's going on in the future, and then took you to a really pressing, how are we going to deal with the digital transformation and the balancing of people and machines, and the sort of shifting network of colleagues, et cetera. And if you could talk about how that unfolded, I think that would be very useful, and what it took to build those networks.
Yes, that's a great idea, Sue. So if we think, so what Sue's referring to now is the most recent work that I've done, and it's the engine for it is now books published by usually academic, but academic presses for managers. So Harvard, MIT, Stanford, all of those universities have book publishers, and those book publishers target books that certainly have more academic books designed to be read by scholars, but also books that are designed to be read by managers. And the last few of them have been about automation and the future of work. What I want to get at is, at my stage now, the engine of my work is often a book published by an academic publisher, but the audience everyone has in mind would be leaders and managers, HR, but probably more broadly. Out of those books will come academic sorts of publications. Chapters in academic edited books is typical for me because I know the people that are editing them. Less common, an A journal publication today. Okay, so that's where I am today. Now, how did we get there? So I arrived at USC, and I was still frustrated with the fact that leaders weren't listening to my things, to other things. A network that I had become deeply involved in was a network of professionals called the Human Resource Planning Society. It was for people who do human resource planning in organizations, and it was venerable. It had been around for 10 years. And about this time, I had enough stature, let's say, and they said, be on our board. So that meant I was working with these executives who were doing human resource planning, many of them with PhDs in IO psychology. We were trying to figure out things to work on, things to present at conferences. And so you saw me on stage a lot. So I was now in these conferences speaking to audiences, not only of practitioners, but also of editors. So an editor from Harvard, I've been talking to her for about a decade. And in about 2005, she called and said, you're ready to write a book for Harvard Press. My very first big university press managerial book called Beyond HR with my colleague, Pete Ramstad. And the book was basically, we felt a call to action to say, HR is broken. And the reason it's broken is that it thinks of itself as serving managers instead of teaching managers. And that's very different from finance, which sees itself as teaching managers about money, and then they're accountable for money. So that was the book. And that sort of moved me to the visibility of someone who was writing books for Harvard. So that was a big platform change with people coming to me. Would you speak to our company, et cetera. So I'm now the practical world knows almost nothing about my academic except that I'm a professor, but they're very interested in this book that I published. So not everyone can do that. I was very, very lucky that this editor had seen our work and was interested in it. So that platform led to the ability to have, and my Cornell history, that sort of led to, and I'll call it a brand in a way, that where people would come to me. And CEO, with this position that Ed and the Center for Effective Organizations had created was also a place where they could gather. So CEO gave me this existing place that had existed for decades before I got there, that had a rhythm of people gathering. It had a rhythm of turn your work into executive education programs, turn your work into eventually webinars like this, et cetera. Sue and Chris were always out in the field. At the time I came, Sue was working with a big company on a large database, and we got together early on around some ideas about turnover. That turned out to be a terrific project for Sue. I'm fine. I just want to give her all the due credit, her and her colleagues. That turned out to be, well, maybe it isn't about people leaving. It's about the change in their attitudes about what work should be and about burnout. And she was way ahead of the game on that. So I was, again, immersed in a network of Sue and Chris, in a network of companies coming to the center, and in this new network that was kind of formed around, with all, I have to say, with all my modesty put aside, there was kind of, people knew this Boudreau thing, you know, and they knew that there was this guy called Boudreau, and he had written a Harvard book, and he was over there at USC, and there was kind of people would come with curiosity to say, what are you thinking? I by now was pretty public about my frustration with HR, you know, and there was research going on about how little HR paid attention to things like the payoff to its programs, and how little HR really looked for evidence-based things. Denise Rousseau and others were really looking at this in the Academy of Management now, where I was also kind of active. So my crowd of generally heads of HR, but also people who work for them, a number of them, you know, they knew me now, and I'd been working with their companies. Let's say this is now probably starting to be the early 2000s. I'd been working with their companies. I was a speaker at their companies, a speaker at conferences, and I was continuing to turn out a little bit of academic work, generally with colleagues that still existed at Cornell, but mostly I had moved to this practitioner world. So at one point they came to me and they said, wow, HR is really broken. This is, let's say, 2002-ish, maybe a little later than that, maybe 2010. And they said, HR is broken. John, would you help us convene a group to work on how to change the game for HR? And this is heads of HR, very successful people. And yet even they were saying, if it stays on this trajectory, it won't be ready for the future. What a wonderful thing. And they said, what we want to do is we want you to help facilitate us, and we'll form self-managing teams, and we'll develop an agenda for the things that HR needs to do differently, or the areas where HR needs to accelerate its pace. And so that became this project that you can look up on the web called Create. It's Create with HR in the middle, so CHREATE. And there was an ebook that came out of it, and there's a website with lots of things that these teams produced, et cetera. And I think that to me is the best example, Chris and Sue, of almost like the network around me came to me, you know, and it wasn't me that said, oh, we need self-managing teams and all that, but they came to me and said, John, we'd like you to be a part of this. We'd like the center to be a part of this. And I think that's probably the epitome of saying, well, I guess I had made it, right? When they come to you and they say, would you help us create this group and be a hub? And my colleague, Ian Ziskin, former head of HR at several organizations, agreed to be a partner in this and lend it that executive credibility as he was retiring from his company. And so then the teams worked out things like, what are the future job titles that HR doesn't even have yet that they're going to need to build? What is the pipeline of leadership in HR? And why does it always come from people who've been in HR forever? And how do we reach out and get more people from marketing and finance and operations, et cetera? These are things that those teams worked on with me doing humble facilitation. But it really felt to me like now, you know, we may have reached a point in the profession where people are ready to self-organize.
Two points, John. One is, you mentioned that, you know, the people are coming to you. I think there's the investment part at the front end, right? The work, the credibility, the writing, the speaking, engagement. There's an investment in that network, and then the network sort of now starts to, there's the reciprocity that happens inside of that network. As you kind of keep pushing out on the boundaries of a set of relationships. There's also a good question in the box, and I think all three of us can speak to it a little bit. And John, you can bring both CARS and CEO into this. And that is, if you're working in a center, if you are part of a center, how does the center maintain its ability to continue being a center? The point is, to maintain the appeal and keep the academic legitimacy, we have to find our way to shift the overarching framework and capital into that. And on the other hand, we have to figure out how to say what we're doing matters to practice. How did CARS sort of handle that? And maybe you can speak to that, John. And Sue, how does CEO sort of maintain that boundary, bridge, back to bridging again?
So Sue, shall I start with CARS?
Sure.
Okay,
Or even CEO, as you experienced it.
Yeah, you can do CEO too.
Then I'll let Sue correct me about CEO. So CARS, as I said, was the mandate was evolved from a bunch of academics, okay, and therefore the mission of CARS was to translate the research that our academic colleagues would be doing anyway to practice. Now that's a little overstated, okay, but it was very much, the engine is journal publications. And first and foremost, we are a group that is going to be doing that. And we're going to be, that's what's going to drive everything, our careers, rewards, all that sort of thing. But we want to be connected to practice. And so we'll form CARS as a place where we can meet with the top HR leaders in the world. And to have it interesting to them, we've got to have some people that are doing good translating. We've got to help those academics make their stuff interesting. And that was kind of Lee and George and me, I would say, although everybody was pretty good at it, okay? But Lee and George were extraordinary at it, Lee Dyer and George Milkovich. And they were kind enough to bring me along as kind of as kind of a protege in a way. They were my mentors. So I would say we were all pretty good at that. Okay, Chris, so that's kind of, and I think even now, if you look at how CARS operates, it's very much about bringing its academic group into the world of practice with a very willing group of executives who understand the deal. Now, I think in most academics encounter leaders in practice that don't have that agreement with them. So it's more like, it's up to, I have my practical world and it's up to you to come to me. You understand my world and show me how it fits, rather than I get it, I'm coming to you to understand your academic work, and we're going to think together about how and why that might be relevant. That's the Cornell magic, okay? Now that's a lot of CEO as well, but Cornell is built on tenure track, publication faculty. So that means that the school is already paying them, they already have a job, they teach classes, and then the center is built to bring that work to the practical world. At CEO, it was a very different model. At CEO, the people who work in CEO need to generate the funding to keep CEO going. So and many of them, most of them were not tenure track faculty, but faculty on contract appointments that at least at the limit would require that we find ways to make CEO so attractive that it would generate money through sponsorships, through academic executive education fees, through big project grants that would keep CEO going. That was very different, Chris and Sue. For me, was now, John, part of your remit is that you're going to have to find a way to generate enough funds to pay for the part of you that's in CEO.
Yeah, and that's the way I've always tried to describe it, is, and back to Jane's question, which is, you better have a set of research interests and be deep enough in them that those interests also match interests of what's happening outside in the real world, so that there's a kind of a giant sucking sound on both sides, right? Mm-hmm. That says, okay, this is the problem that we're facing, and you seem to be studying this issue, and either because they were sponsors of the center, or were friends of sponsors of the center, that network sort of built itself out. So there was always this, we have to be sure that the work that we're doing is academically credible, but it had also better be practically relevant. Otherwise, you're going to sit in the ivory tower.
Yeah.
And I also hear in Jane's question another element, which is sort of, this is the time element that practitioners lose interest in certain topics and gain interest in other topics. And if you don't stay up with that, you can't find ways to fund and find resources for what you're doing, whether it's even from a government funding agency. If it isn't topical, if it isn't, unless you're in a basic science, they don't want to fund something that isn't something that's an issue that's going to move whatever their agenda is forward. And this is the same way with practice. But I also think that's on us to say, I know enough about practice to know that this issue, which we started studying, and I'll use it, the cross-functional teams issue, we started studying in 88, knowledge work teams, and in 95 had done 3 10-company studies and had our book out. And we had a lot of interest in our executive programs where we taught people skills around how do you manage with teams.
Yeah.
How do teams fit together? How do they fit with the agenda of the company, et cetera, the strategic view of teams. But what was starting to emerge was that companies that competed based on deep expertise were finding that cross-functional teams reduced their cutting edge ability to compete on proprietary intellectual property. And it was a pretty clear pattern. And so our next study, and 8 of our 10 companies came into it because they were experiencing it, and we knew they were experiencing it, and they helped determine our research agenda, came into it, was how do you both maintain, what kind of organizational design approaches do you need to maintain your deep expertise and to be able to combine expertises for today's solutions. And then the next study, which they all got into all kinds of problems because now they were messing with the core design of the organization, was how do you do this kind of change? Because it's core systems change, reconceptualizing the organization. And 7 of the companies that were in our original study stayed with us through what became a 12-company study around the change process of fundamental transformation and how you're designed. That was a 20-year saga, no, maybe 15. And those companies were really at the beat of our agenda. And we had to figure out and continually expand our own academic discipline input, as well as bring in new perspectives from the field. And the perspectives from the field that started to come in were strategy perspectives and business leader perspectives, not HR perspectives anymore. HR was now one of the functions that needed to learn how to do this. And so we changed our network, we changed our stakeholder list, et cetera. What's happened since then is the stakeholder list has grown. In our society, in the world, we now have to worry about multiple stakeholders. We can't worry about just the financial outcomes anymore. And so that's when we switched over to looking at how do you make organizations sustainable dynamically so they can preserve the interests of ecology, of society, of community, et cetera. And specifically, it gets back to employees because all these changes are going to totally disrupt the contract with employees. And if you would go there, John, because I think your current work is really looking at that this technology that's now disrupting everything is also going to disrupt the fundamental agreement between people and organizations. And how do you position yourself to be able to help deal with that issue?
So yeah, and I think it's so as I'm thinking about what you say, it's for those of you listening, it's been a wonderful ride and an interesting one. I think Sue and Chris epitomize really a model of being unbelievably skilled, maybe almost without parallel, at putting together the kinds of consortia that Sue has described. Multiple companies organized around an issue that is research interested as well as practical. I think Sue and Chris in their work tend to create the kind of thing we had at Cornell. They tend to create that agreement that this is going to be different, perhaps, from what you want as a practitioner or what you might get from a consulting firm. Yes, you want this, and we'll deliver on it. However, understand that to do it with rigor, there's this other science that we need to bring in. And in my case, it's not so much multi-company consortia around like a big research project, as much as it's multi-company consortia around, let's say, an issue or an idea or something like that. So it may, and I think in my own work, there is academic research that's relevant, but it's of less of a concern to me these days. So I know about it, I read it, but I'm no longer so much concerned about publishing for that group as much as I am about working with my practical world. It's not that I don't care, and it's not that I don't do it, but I tend to do it upon invitation now, rather than saying, well, I've got to get another A publication out. That is not where I live. So for me, when I go out into the field, now I'm hearing things like, well, John, we know that, for example, we know that you're interested in helping enhance, maybe the HR profession's evidence-based use, or how we think about how we teach leaders. But these are the issues that we're confronting: automation, et cetera. And what happens in my network is I'm beginning to encounter then really good thought partners who work in consulting firms. Pete Ramstad was one of the first ones. Currently, the last few books have been with my partner, Robin J. Suthasan, who worked at Willis Towers Watson, who's now working at Mercer. Robin and his team in the consulting firm are extraordinarily good at taking an idea and then finding examples in the field. They're also good at it. So they operate for me as an amplified version of people who can take an idea out in the field, test it out, and then come back in and help me understand how it didn't work. And that's where Robin was the one that said, John, having worked with me on a number of books, what's going on out there is this emergence of, for example, work that isn't employment, contractors, freelancers, et cetera. And we ought to be thinking about a book about that. And let me give you some examples of the dilemmas that companies are facing. And then, very generously is willing to let me perhaps put a framework around that. Or to say, this is Wayne Cassio and I write a chapter about the academic research on these arrangements and find that most of them haven't even been examined. In parallel, I'm writing a book with Robin. So Sue, that began the, gosh, look at this. All of your systems in your company are built around jobs and employment. And yet there's this vast array of work arrangements that's emerging that your systems can't even tackle. The next book, again, at Robin's suggestion, we went to Harvard, and I sort of said, I think where this is all leading is you're going to have to look at work not in jobs, but as tasks. To be honest, the editor said, I don't think anybody's ready or interested in that, John. That sounds pretty boring to me. And Robin said, but wait, we're working on automation over here in our consulting firm, and automation requires that you automate at the task level, not at the job level. You see what I mean? So the editor said, oh, we would like a book on automation at Harvard. So I said, Robin, I think they're wrong. I think I'm onto something here, but they're not ready for it. And I'm happy to write another book with you, and we'll sneak in this idea of deconstruction. All right. And so that's the next book with MIT Press is about deconstruction. That is, so finally, I get to do my book that says, if you look at work as jobs, if you look at workers as job holders, you're going to miss the patterns because they have to be deconstructed into their parts. And then that's where your systems have to operate. But it took 2 tries. Now, in parallel, there's a lot of academic work out there now about work crafting, about how people build their work even within a job description, and how that creates motivation and engagement and autonomy and things like that. That's a decades-old stream of research that honestly I wasn't even really aware of, but it turns out it's quite relevant to what's happening in the world today. More fluid work, people who've been pushed to work at home, reinventing their work, people even on location, like assembly lines, et cetera. So Sue, that's kind of, it's interesting that I wasn't driven toward either automation or alternative arrangements by the academic world as much as by the opportunity to work with my consultant thought partner, Robin, on things that he was telling me are really interesting out there. And in some ways, that motivated the academic writing that I did. It was the
It came
book.
from your network. It came from your network.
That's
I think
exactly
that's
right.
that's a really important thing. And the other thing is it evolved as the issues and problems evolved. And if
Yes.
you go right back to Andy's book on engaged research, he has the problem-focused research right in the center. That if it
Mhm.
doesn't deal with issues that are really being tackled in today's world and need to be tackled, that it's very difficult to have impact on practice. You have to become engaged and know what they're experiencing. And I think you just gave a perfect flow of how one thing led to another, and then led to another in your work.
And
Thanks.
there's a couple of comments in the chat around this issue. One is, I think it was and Zoe said, you know, as in terms of thinking about your career, you've got to be passionate and be willing to accept a non-traditional course, right, to move forward in what you want. And second, there's a couple of comments about actually sort of methodological, and that is to get your research positioned, I guess is the word I would use, for application and practice. You're going to have to back away from the randomized, you know, Latin squared designs. You're going to have to start thinking about the way your work is conducted in the real world so that it has the credibility and rigor from a practical point of view, right? So there's some really interesting comments over there about in looking at the stories that you've been telling, John and Sue, and saying and pulling it up and saying, I've got to make some choices about this. And I think that's really one of the key messages of the book is be sure you're clear about who you are and what you want to be and where you're going and what your values are, because that's going to be a big part of those choices. And that's what there was just some interesting stuff.
Just to build on Ann's comment about non-traditional, as part of our book, we interviewed about 20 people that we thought were really doing very relevant research that bridged, you know, from the ivory tower into actual practice and having impact on practice. John was one of them. And I would say that 18 of them did not do something that would be considered non-traditional. They branched from a fairly traditional start to enriching their research by becoming problem focused. And they did it often by setting up centers because that was a safe place to do it. The thing the center has given me, I don't know what you guys would say about this, but the reason I left my traditional role was because I wanted to study things that took longer than a year and 5 articles every year. I wanted to study things that were systemic. To do that took time, it took relationships, it took patience, it took building the sites. I wanted to study it in the field. And I didn't see room for that in my traditional academic appointment. And personally, I would have left academia totally had I not been able to find a hybrid home. But most of these people intentionally positioned themselves in academia in a way where they could pursue their relevant research. Wayne Cassio says, I picked the third most statusful offer I had because it had 3 people who were doing work in the field that I knew I was going to be able to do relevant research.
Yeah.
You know, Rob Cross, who we'll talk to next session, chose to go and work in an institute at MIT for 2 years before he went into a mainstream academic. He always was going to go into academia, but he said, I need to really find out what's going on because I'm studying networks. And at MIT, there is a huge program where they know a lot more about that on the ground than us who are doing mathematical equations know. in academia. Those are just two examples, and they all had pathways, but the thing that was common is they intended to do work of value to practice from the time they got their PhDs.
And that Took had a great comment about that, Sue, and he's going to hop on, and that is it's multidisciplinary, right? This stuff is multidisciplinary. His comment is practice is always explained in multidisciplinary manner. So how do you get a disciplinary sort of focus in your research and in your training and then branch out? So his specific question is, in an open innovation strategic and HR theory, how will that be used to explain the practice, and in turn from the empirical research, we can gain insight to improve the existing HR strategic theory? I mean, his question is about how do we're in the field and we're back and forth between all these things, and we can't just continue to look at the world with our narrow blinders on.
And part of that, I think, John, you've talked about this a little. Part of that is the team that you compose. So you mentioned the study that we did that was, why are people turning over and why are they not getting the value they want from our company, from working in our company, was really the question that was asked. And we had people multidisciplinary, and we had 4 rigorous academic researchers articles come out of that, because we had a doctoral student who did a dissertation and took a slice of those data and put it in a very traditional academic journal. We could get into the change journals and so forth, and we could get into career-oriented journals. I mean, career-oriented articles into organization behavior journals. So I think once you start looking at a system, you find you can take lots of different sort of pathways in looking at it, and you can relate it to rigorous research that's being done. And part of it is I always have partnered with someone who is a pretty traditional standard academic in most of those early studies, who were just great at taking data and turning it into an article. It wasn't where their heart was, but it was where their paycheck was. And by the way, it advanced theory. So I think this combination is creative. And I wouldn't say it's always non-traditional, but I think it's always entrepreneurial and creative.
And added one more point on top of that, but I think all 3 of us agree. You better be good at what you're doing, right? I mean, there's not much room here for sort of shoddy work. You better be on your game, and that's where a lot of credibility comes from. With that, I'm going to recognize that we're running on to time, and respect that for those that need to jump off at the hour and a half at the 90-minute level. Some final thoughts, comments from the 2 of you around the work that you're doing and where you're going, and what's next in your work. John, I'll start with you. You get to be the kickoff person here. Where are you going now?
Well, I think so. As I said, I think right now what's on my mind is I really think organizations are bound up in a system, in a job-based system, let's call it. So that idea of deconstruction, I think, has tectonic implications for research theory, for the way HR is done, for the way what leaders are going to want from this people relationship. So that's really fascinating to me. I think we're seeing research begin to be done on it. There's more and more attention to alternative work arrangements, more and more attention to worker-driven work design. I think this tectonic shift in, I hope it will be toward worker power, with workers saying, I just won't come back under the same arrangements you had before, with workers saying, I don't accept your definition of safety, and until you accept mine, I won't work for you. I'm hoping that kind of power shift continues, and I think it's going to be a really interesting area for research. I probably won't be initiating the academic articles, but as I think lots of people have said, I've been, Anne Tsui is someone who's been many times right there to say, John, here's an academic outlet for this idea that you've had. Wayne Cassio, others. So I think for me, Chris, I'll keep pushing the ideas, and I'll be fortunate enough that wonderful, wonderful colleagues come to me and say, hey, you know what? There's a more scholarly article that we could write, something like that.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating what you're saying. And you think about the bureaucratic model. What's the foundation of the bureaucratic model? It's a job and a job description. And we think we're so smart that we can actually specify what everybody's going to do, and it'll all fit together and work really well. And that foundation is being blown up, literally.
And there's big practical databases, lots of startups working on things like skills and skills language. There's just so much going on, Chris, in the world of startups that involves breaking apart jobs, and only then you can see what's going on. So I think that's where the big data will probably come from next, is people like LinkedIn, and other startups that are working on that. So at some point, I hope somebody gets hold of it and we really start to watch what's happening.
Yeah.
And the thing that really interests me the most about all this is it's probably about the third time in my career where there's been a pretty tectonic shift. And this one, I think, is probably the most tectonic, and ideas that we've been talking about theoretically, and we maybe doing some field experimentation with, that simply don't get into practice widespread because it looks too different. It questions the hierarchical model. It does this, it does that. It questions the sense at the people at the top of the organization that the organization exists for shareholders and them as executives. It questions a huge amount of assumptions. Those ideas that we've been sort of pushing, not those ideas, but the opposite, which is it would be far better if you could actually bring people into the mission of the organization. If you could find work situations that fit, it would be far better for you and for all your stakeholders. We've had a virus, and that virus has achieved more in terms of unfreezing assumptions than any work we as academics have done. And I think we need to really take that to heart and say, we've got to be really in tune with the context we work in and where the opportunities are to start shifting how people think about the purpose of organizations and what effectiveness means. We've got to really look for the contextual supports that will help move this forward, because technology is going to move it forward really fast, potentially without any consideration to the human.
I couldn't agree more. There's such amazing questions out there for academics to tackle. And so for me, every time I get an academic speech, I bang on them and say, if you have job in your hypothesis, step back and ask.
Find a new language. John froze. You're frozen, John.
It's okay. Sue, I'm going to put up the last couple of slides, and if you can sort of bridge over to our next thing here.
Yeah, on December 2nd, we're going to have a third session based on the work we did for the book. I mean, we had so many wonderful contributors that it seemed like it would be a shame not to really do some deep dive. And this is going to be with Rob Cross, who is at Babson University, but also is one of the co-leaders of Collective Commons, which is a very large consortium of companies and academics and NGOs and other groups that are really trying to deal with the notion that the world is becoming networked. And he's going to talk about his own journey studying networks and moving into situations where he involves the full network in the research. One of the models he has is to make the academics, or the practitioners in the network researchers, and he's giving them tools, and together people are learning and sharing data and sharing analysis and so forth. But the thing that we really want to look at in the third one is the relationships, not just who you're related to and when you're related to them, but what does it take to actually have a cross-discipline collaboration, a collaboration with practitioners, a mutual cyclical exchange of knowledge with practitioners, something that is stable and where the different stakeholders involved in the research are really able to communicate and generate mutual value. That's what we're really going to look at in part 3. Phil Mirvis will be joining us again. I think he's on the line now. And I and Rob Pross will be with you if you care to join us on December 2nd.
Fantastic. And then, like I said, if you're looking to buy the book, the code's here at the bottom. I want to be sure to get this up on the screen so that it's part of the recording. And for those that want to use the codes there at the bottom.
And I think this is going to be sent out to you in an email as well after the session.
Yeah, exactly. And so respecting people's time, we'll stay on if people want to sort of chat a little bit. I want to thank John for spending the time to think through this webinar with us and exchanging ideas. It's always interesting to find out what John is up to, and thank him very much for sharing his experience and his origin story and how he has used the network and build collaborative relationships both within academia and between academia and practice. John, thanks. The work you're doing is great. I really appreciate your contribution to the webinar today. And with that, those who need to leave can leave. Those who want to stay on and chat a little bit, we're happy to do that. I will stop sharing.